CNN projects Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States.
Towards China, but also towards Europe and other countries, Biden would have a more cooperative, a more engaged style.
The biggest competitor is China. And depending on how we handle that.
So some serious compromises and concessions on both sides have to be made. It could be that American foreign policy towards China will not be totally different. But I do think that while the fundamentals will stay very similar, I would say, but there will also be some important differences. And I think the differences will probably be in the nuances rather than in the big radical approaches towards China. First of all, the United States believes that China is taking liberties, that China has become too assertive in all respects, be it geopolitical, be it like the South China Sea, Taiwan, be it human rights, Hong Kong, Xinjiang and other issues, or in trade relations where the United States strongly believes China has taken liberties and is exploiting the United States. And I think that basic belief is probably shared by many Americans and by both Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and also by President Trump and President-elect Biden. But the approach of the Biden administration would differ from the approach of the Trump administration. And I think that actually is not just what is typical for America's approach towards China, but it's a global approach. Towards China, but also towards Europe and other countries, Biden would have a more cooperative, a more engaged style. He is not a man, and his will not be an administration keen on conflict and confrontation. I think he will look for engagement and cooperation. That doesn't mean he will have a soft foreign policy, or it doesn't mean he can be taken for a ride or can be pushed about, but he will be more open to compromise, more open to a cooperative multilateral approach. And I think that will also apply to the policy he will conduct towards China. And I think that in principle is good because it opens a way to engagement, it opens a new era of hopefully cooperation. But regarding trade policy, for example, Biden will also expect China to make important concessions. These concessions, for example, will be in reciprocal market access to the Chinese market. The Europeans and the Americans believe together that China is not giving too much access, not sufficient access to many Western companies. Pharmaceuticals, the media, financial services, chemical companies, computer companies, high-tech companies partially, and so on and so on. And he will insist on that opening to the Chinese market. Of course, the Chinese government will push against that, as they have done in the past. They will also push against that in the future. And I think the likelihood of a really constructive dialogue between the United States under Biden and China is much larger from January 2020 than it was for the last year or two under the Trump administration. And I think that is a positive aspect, that the beliefs, the convictions in America, but also in Europe, I think, regarding what China needs to do will not really differ all that much. But the approach and the possibilities to arrive at a compromise, I think they will be much larger than before. You can actually look at the year 2017, Trump's first year in office, when relations with China were not bad at all. And they met at Mar-a-Lago in early 2017, and Trump and Xi Jinping got on famously. They were actually pretty close to each other. And the reason why was that Trump put his trade problems with China aside, because he said, I need China for my policy on North Korea. because he wanted China to put pressure on North Korea so that North Korea would give up its nuclear missile program. He hoped that China would put sanctions on North Korea, would be less close to North Korea, make North Korea's life difficult. And so he was nice in terms of trade relations with China in order to get something from the Chinese government. And the Chinese government did give something, but not as much as he had hoped. And by late 2017, I would say even late summer, early fall 2017, Trump realized that China was not doing enough regarding North Korea, at least not as much as he wanted. And he became very disappointed with China. And then he resorted back to his old thinking about China regarding trade relations and became increasingly critical about China. By 2018, he basically had had enough. And he embarked on what we have called the trade war between China and the United States. And that was really happened in full flow from August 2018, I would say. And it dominated the remainder of his government, the entire last year, 2019, but also 2020. And so you have two phases. First, a good, benign phase because of North Korea, and then that hostile phase, which we have seen for the last 2 years and more. There are two great powers. You have an established power, the United States, and you have a rising power, China. It is pretty clear that China, with its huge population, its huge economic potential, it also increasingly is its very good innovative power and creative power, that China wants a seat at the table of the great powers. It wants to become more important in world affairs. This is perfectly understandable. What is less understandable is how it goes about to achieve that. And the West often says China is not prepared to make concessions, partially also for domestic reasons, because, for example, if China did make compromises regarding the state-owned enterprises, gave them less subsidies, gave them less tax incentives, basically did not favor them as much as the Chinese government does at the moment, that would lead perhaps to unemployment in China, that these state-owned companies had to really become smaller, could employ fewer people. And that would, of course, if you have unemployment in China, this causes domestic problems. So the Chinese feel they are kind of constrained by what they can offer because of domestic repercussions. And of course, the Western countries see that, but they also say, but we are still, being swamped with Chinese subsidized goods, which is unfair. So a compromise needs to be achieved. And I think that is quite possible because in the past, both great powers were able to cooperate. Why not in the future? Maybe things have become more difficult. They certainly haven't become easier during the last 4 years, but I'm not saying that it is impossible. And I'm pretty sure that the Biden administration is not interested in what analysts have called a new Cold War with China. No one is interested in that who is seriously concerned about global relations. And I think the Biden administration will try its best to avoid a course of conflict and confrontation. So, and Biden as a person, when you look at his career, 50 years in politics almost, he is very much a person of compromise, a person who emphasizes personal relations a lot, who is a chummy sort of person, who's not interested in conflict and confrontation, but he's not a softie either. So you cannot expect, or no one can expect, that you can just push him around and mess him about. So some serious compromises and concessions on both sides have to be made. I know Graham Allison quite well. He wrote that book about the Thucydides trap, which in the end, if you want to interpret it harshly, says conflict with China is inevitable. And I don't really think he says that if you read all of his book rather than just a few chapters from his book. He says, essentially, if we do not pay attention, if we are not careful, the conflict could happen. but it doesn't mean a conflict is inevitable under all circumstances. So if we pay attention, if we embark on a course of compromise and cooperation and engagement, then conflict is not necessary at all and will not happen. And I believe that is the right attitude. So we should really look at the whole picture. There are some scholars, some so-called China hawks in Western countries, largely in the United States, but also in other countries, who do believe that there will be a war and a conflict with China. But these are the hawks, these are the real hardliners. And they were represented quite a bit in the Trump administration. I cannot see that they will be represented that much in a Biden administration. People like Navarro, who wrote that book about deaths by China, who also was an important economic advisor to Trump, who certainly had a very negative attitude towards China. I cannot see that many of these people will be in the Biden administration. And that is important. You will always have these hawks in some think tanks, in some newspapers, but what matters is the majority thinking along these lines. And I don't really think so. There will be hardliners and they will, give interviews and will frighten some people. But I do not think that that is the majority of the think tankers or analysts. And the American administration has become more skeptical, more critical of China. But no one wants military war or conflict. And one of the successes of the Trump administration was to not involve America in a major war. Instead, soldiers have come back to the United States, and Trump has been keen on ending wars, or at least, scaling them down. So I cannot see that the American population is keen on having any major war in the Middle East or elsewhere, and certainly not with China.